but today as we finish it off, this isn't so much of a burning question, this is a burning statement. Here's the statement this morning that we're going to cover. It's hard to follow Jesus when Christians don't live like him. I don't know if you've ever felt that way before, but when you look at the church or you see somebody's a Christian and you just think, that person's a hypocrite, or that church is full of hypocrites, or that church just judges so many people. Here's what I want you to know. The very definition of being a Christian is that you and I are all hypocrites. Because what we're admitting and what we're recognizing is that we are sinners and we're not saved because we became perfect or because we became good enough. We're saved because we had a Savior who was good enough, who took the punishment for our sins. So all of us, to some degree, whether big or even small, we are going to be, to some degree, hypocrites. Now, we have to take that and use it wisely, because we can't use this as a license to sin and be like, well, God just gives grace, so let's keep on making mistakes. No, we have to realize as Christians that we have a witness to the world. How we live makes an actual difference. Now, the good news is this. If you are one of those people and you jive with this question, maybe you're a skeptical Christian or skeptical person, and you're here because your spouse wants you to be here or because your mom wants you to be here, and you're like, yeah, I don't really know about this because I see how you guys live. Here's what I want you to know. The good news is Jesus actually talked about this very thing. So we're going to turn to our Bibles, if you got yours this morning, to Matthew chapter 23, and we are going to hear a sort of scorched earth, scathing rebuke from Jesus. And as we read through this, some of you may feel some guilt, conviction, or condemnation. I don't want you to feel that. I want you to know this morning that you may have walked in feeling arrogant or prideful or self-righteous or lustful and kind of feeling the weight to that, but I want you to walk out as free people, forgiven people, based on what Jesus says here. We'll start in verse 23. He says this to the Pharisees, the teachers of the law. He says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but you swallow a camel. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean." One last time, Jesus says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside, you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness." Isn't Jesus so nice? It's tough to hear, but I love this story. So there was a bartender, big, strong bartender, owned a bar in a small town. And they would often have longshoremen and construction workers and captains from ships come in and be at their bar. And he would often do a contest. He was a strong man, so he'd hold up a lemon, and he would squeeze the lemon dry. He'd squeeze it as dry as he possibly could. He said, if anybody else can come in and squeeze this lemon again, and if anything comes out, I'll give you $1,000 and a free drink. And all these big, strong, burly men would come into the bar. They would squeeze the lemon so hard, but no other drops could come. This bartender squeezed that lemon dry. And then this scrawnier guy comes in. He's in a polyester suit on a work trip. He's got those thick black-rimmed glasses with the tape in the middle. And he says, "Can I try?" And everybody sort of erupts in laughter. There's no way this guy can do it. He walks over to the bar, he grabs the lemon, and he squeezes that. And not one, not two, but 6 drops fall into the dish. And immediately you can hear a pin drop. People stop laughing. The bartender slides him $1,000 and a free drink, and he says, "Hey, before you walk away and go have your drink, what do you do for a living?" And the man said, "I'm an auditor with the IRS." If you're an auditor, I apologize. But they're so good at squeezing every drop. In fact, tax season comes wrong, and why are we scared of taxes? Not just because, hey, we might owe some or might get some back. We're scared because we don't want to get audited. What do auditors do? They don't leave a stone unturned. They go through your finances, they go through your taxes, and they turn everything upside down, and they make you come up with evidence for everything. If you're ever audited, if you've been audited, you know how this goes. It's tough. This is what Jesus is doing with the Pharisees. He is looking at their lives, leaving no stone unturned, and he's using his Jesus power and saying, hey, I see you following the law. You're doing a phenomenal job. The first thing he says is, you're even tithing your spices, right? In the Old Testament, there is a law that you have to tithe part of your income. And he's saying, you're not only giving your money, he says, you give 1/10 of your spices, your mint, your dill, your cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And essentially what Jesus is saying is, you have gone so far to follow the law that it's not even about your money anymore. You are opening up your kitchen cabinets and you're giving it to God. That's amazing and that's impressive. And Jesus actually says, you should keep doing this. But then he turns to them and says, you've neglected the mercy, the justice, and the faithfulness. In other words, what you do is great, but how you feel about people is not. You've walked through these religious works, but your heart is still in a sinful place. And if that's not enough, Jesus, again, he says, you clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisees first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside will also be clean. Jesus goes even further. How many of you have those Hydro Flask coffee mugs or water bottles? I love those things. They keep your water cold for like 13 days, which is completely unnecessary. Just drink it. But I wash mine. I use one all the time, and I wash it on a daily basis whenever I'm using it. Took me about a year to realize that when you unscrew the cap, or when you take off the lid, there is a small gasket around the inside of that. And if you don't take that off and clean it, you are probably drinking out of a moldy cup that you will never realize. Some of you are nodding like, yeah, you moron, you should have known that. So for some of you, you're like, what? Yeah. I clean that cup every time I use it. And yet, for almost a year, I was drinking out of a moldy cup. I finally took that gasket off, and I could not believe it. Now I'm like the stickler in the home, taking apart everybody's water bottles, making sure everything is clean. This is what Jesus is telling the Pharisees. You look so good on the outside. Your water's still cold. Great cup. And yet the inside makes your clean cup actually dirty. You've made it look great on the outside, but inside you've completely neglected it. Jesus goes even further. He says, you are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the Old Testament, there was a law for the Jewish people that said they could not enter into the temple if they had any blood from animals or people on their hands. They were what's called ceremonially unclean. And this law applied to not only blood, but also pigs and also dead people and your dying relatives. And so what would happen is if you had somebody dying in your home and you touched them, you were unclean. You had to go to the temple to go through a ritual washing ceremony, and then you'd have to wait a certain amount of time. Then you could enter into the temple. But this becomes a really big hurdle if your mom or dad passes away and you want to care for them, but they've died in your living room and you want to wrap them up properly, you want to bury them properly, you want to put them in a nice tomb, but now you're also unclean. And so what people would do is they not only put these special cloths around people, they also would whitewash their tombs. They would paint them with a thick layer of white paint. And not only did this make the tombs just beautiful, because in the desert, everything's brown, everything's red, everything's just blah. But when you see a white tomb, it's just this beautiful picture. It's like putting flowers on a gravesite. Makes it pretty. Not only that, but the Jewish people believed that that thick layer of white paint actually created a degree of separation, meaning I can go touch that tomb and I won't become ceremonially unclean. I will still be clean. I can still go do my sacrifices and worship in the temple. The problem is a layer of white paint doesn't do that much work. They were making it go way further than it was ever meant to go. And Jesus is saying, you're still touching the same thing. You are still unclean. You look beautiful on the outside, but you're still unclean because of what's on the inside. And so Jesus is just going right for the hearts and the minds and the souls of the Pharisees. And I love this because when Jesus gets really stern, when Jesus just cuts to the chase, it's not towards the orphan and the widow who are hurting and broken. And yes, they can be sinners too, but Jesus is often very gentle and compassionate with people who are broken and recognize their brokenness, recognize their poverty, recognize their imperfection. But when Jesus is speaking to religious people who are self-righteous, not only self-righteous in and of themselves, but they are breaking the law in secret and then acting in public like they're doing nothing wrong, even bragging about what they're doing because they're so perfect. These are the people that Jesus goes scorched earth on. Jesus pulls no punches on people who believe that they are better than everybody else. Because the reality is, when people are self-righteous, they're the ones who need the scathing rebuke. Otherwise, Jesus will never get to what's in their heart. And I see this all the time, not just in people's lives, but honestly in my own life. Like I said at the beginning, the very definition of a Christian is that we are all hypocrites. The difference between, I think, an authentic, genuine follower of Jesus is that we're ready to admit it. And this isn't license to sin, like, hey, we're all hypocrites. God will give us grace. Go do what you want to do. No, we want to live in obedience. We want to live in obedience because it's not only God's way and we should follow God's way. God's way is best for us. It will lead to a life of flourishing if you follow in His instruction and in His way. And yet, I'll be the first to tell you, I think my wife would be the second to tell you, we're all imperfect in this. The difference is, are we ready and willing to admit it? Because I know this, just because we go to church, it does not make us a Christian. Just because we have a Bible in our home, it does not make us a Christian, any more than sitting in a garage makes you a car, or wearing a camel hat makes you a hunter. We got to be authentically living out the faith. And if this is you to the point where it's like, I've seen these inauthentic, I've seen these believers who are they're not genuine about their faith, they're hypocrites. And it's keeping you away from the faith. Here's what I would tell you. Number one, some people who call themselves Christians are not actually Christians. And I don't say this from a place of condemnation, like, yeah, look at those people over there. All of you are great, but man, you guys got to figure it out. I say this from a place where people have been genuinely hurt in their faith by people who are not actually born-again believers. This causes a lot of harm in the church. People who have a bumper sticker on the back of their car that says, I love Jesus, but then they treat every person that they meet, every person that they come across with judgment and condemnation. They're not living out the way of Jesus themselves. And the reality is not just because they're a little hypocritical, they got some things to work on. They might not be actually born again. They might not be true and genuine believers. And I don't bring up this point because I want every believer in the room right now to all of a sudden question our faith. Be like, well, am I a Christian? What does he think about me? No, here's how I think we know when we're genuine believers. Here's how it's worked in my life. Number one, I could feel it. When I gave my life to Jesus, when He came into my life and completely changed me from the inside out, there was a difference in how I felt and carried myself. And feelings can be subjective. I know that. But this was different. I had believed I was a Christian for probably 10 years. Going through middle school, going through high school, I had told people, yeah, I'm a Christian. I went to every youth group you could, even when I hated it. I went to church every single Sunday. If you were to ask me one-on-one or in public on a stage, yeah, I'm a believer. And yet my life was defined by punk rock, alcohol, drugs, insecurity, and a lot of anger. And when I made that decision to say, no more, I either have to go full on, follow Jesus, or nothing, I could feel that weight come off my shoulders and my chest. That weight of guilt and condemnation and conviction, everything lifts off. That shame is freedom. That's being born again. There's a lot of people in the room where you know what the tangible presence of God feels like, and it's like nothing else. There's more evidence for this. The evidence is how you've changed. Like I said, we're all hypocrites, but we don't abuse God's grace. If you're a Christian, you should see some evidential change happening in your life. We look at the fruits of the Spirit, and I say, for me, how I was defined before I became a Christian, it was anger, it was alcohol, it was drugs, it was frustration, it was insecurity. There were so many sins that I could list off that we'd be here all day. But who God has transformed me into by His grace, not my own power, I look at the fruits of the Spirit, I say, because of Jesus, am I more loving? Yeah. Because of the fruits of the Spirit, because of Jesus, am I more kind, gentle, and patient? Of course, I'm not perfect. But I've seen the evidence of what God has done in my life. I've seen the evidence of what He's done in your life. I know some of you. I knew some of you before you knew Jesus. And who you are today, by the grace and the power of God, is radically different. And so if you're questioning, like, hey, am I a hypocrite? Am I a genuine believer? You probably are. But you might fall into categories 2 or 3. Category 1 is that we might not be true believers. But category number 2 is that some Christians are still spiritually immature. And that's okay. I was on the prayer team a few years ago. We had a whole line of people come forward for prayer. It was powerful. And this one guy came up at the end. He's like, I actually don't need prayer. I just want to share a testimony with you and how God's changed my life. Radical transformation from drugs and alcohol to sobriety and following Jesus. Like only God could do in this man's life what he did. It's powerful stuff. And at the end of the conversation, he goes, isn't God just so effing good? And I'm like, I wouldn't have put it that way, but I agree with you. Yeah. He's like, gosh, just so effing good. Like, I love it. Like, genuine conversion. Some things to work on, right? I'm convinced that the only time it's okay to swear is when you're working on your car, okay? That's a joke. I think the most genuine, mature believers, when they got some knuckle busters working on their brakes, it happens. But we see this in people's lives all the time. If you became a Christian yesterday, I don't expect you to know the whole book of Genesis tomorrow. I don't expect you to memorize the Romans road or what the definition of sanctification is. We're on a journey. And sometimes people who are spiritually immature will give Christianity a bad name. And what we have to do is lovingly point people back to Jesus. I see this on social media from time to time. Somebody that I know is genuinely following Jesus. But then I see a picture of them on a Saturday night, and they're at the bar, and there's nothing wrong with having a drink, having a beer now and then. But you can tell when people's eyes are a little glazed over, a little sweaty. It's like, oh, okay, maybe they've had a little too much. Are they not a Christian? Of course they're still a believer. But there's some things we got to work on. There's some things we have to mature on. And I think unbelievers, if you're an unbeliever and you're skeptic towards Christianity because of this, I want you to know that we are all falling short in some areas of our lives. And we have grace for one another. And don't let what some immature Christians do change your whole perspective of Jesus, the church, or Christianity. Which leads me into my next point. The last one is this. Even the most mature Christians will still sin. There may be times in my career here at New Hope, which I hope to be here for decades like Pastor Bill was. There may be times where I have to get up on the stage and I have to apologize about something because I went too far in a sermon or I said something that was a little too strong or it wasn't very loving. There might be times where we're in a one-on-one conversation. I said something a little offhand or my heart wasn't in the right place. There's times in my life where, here's an example. Pastor John sitting right here, he used to be my manager. Now I'm his manager. But he was my manager a few years ago, and there was some sin in my life that, I was relatively aware of, but I'm too funny. I didn't want to deal with it yet. It's sarcasm. Sarcasm can be a really big deal for me, or at least, this is one of the things that by the grace of God, I've grown immensely in. I'm still sarcastic from time to time, but there was a period for a few years there where sarcasm had more than reached its limit. And John pulled me aside in the office one day. We were in our one-on-one, and he just called this out, and we talked through it. We prayed through it. We talked about some things about why and all that, but it's even mature Christians will fail you. You might have a mom or a dad in your life who's a strong believer, come to church they bring you to church. They have brought you to the faith. But on Tuesday nights, everybody's stressed and tired. They yell at you. They might slam a door. It's like, whoa, we will fail you. We are imperfect people. I was listening to a pastor just a few months ago talk about how he experienced this in his own church. He was a preaching pastor at a church for about 10 years in Tennessee. And he had moved on to this church in Texas where he became the lead pastor. And before he transitioned into this new role, he met with a therapist because the reason why he was leaving this church in Tennessee wasn't just because, hey, bigger and better job out in Texas. No, he was done with the church that he had been serving in. There were 6 people in this church that every time he said something from stage on a sermon, they would be like, oh, you shouldn't have said that, or they just critiqued everything. Anytime he wanted to make a change in the church, it was like changing a light bulb from green to blue, they would critique him. They would give him feedback that wasn't necessary. And it got to the point where he was like, I'm done, I'm walking away. And this therapist, as he was talking through these feelings, he said, well, how many people was this? How many people were hurting you? He's like, 6 people. Then he said, well, how many people are in your church? There's about 750 people, he said. And he said, don't let what 6 people out of 750 people, don't let what those 6 people do ruin your whole perspective of not only that church, but Jesus and Christianity. Because people will fail you. In fact, Brennan Manning, he's an author from the 60s and the 70s. He wrote an incredible book sort of along these lines, but he said this, and this is one of those quotes that it'll cut to your core. He said, the greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips, walk out the door, and deny him by their lifestyle. This is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. And I share this quote because it kind of cuts to the core. We have to recognize that our lives are a testimony. When you walk out of this church today, you represent New Hope. You also represent Jesus to an unbelieving world. How we live, how we talk, how we act, how we respond to life. The tough thing that we need to hear is people are watching. Now, that doesn't mean we walk out and we just put all this pressure on ourselves and pucker up and try so hard. No, loosen up, give yourself grace, but know that people are watching. And I share this quote because Brennan Manning, while he was a genuine believer, I believe that we will see him in heaven. He died back in the 80s. He passed away from complications with alcoholism. So the guy that wrote this quote, calling us out for our sinful lifestyles, even though we're believers, had his own sinful lifestyle. The point is this, I believe his faith was genuine. I believe we will see him in heaven, but even the most mature Christians will still let you down. I hope that you can follow me as I follow Jesus, as Paul says in the New Testament. He says, follow me as I follow Christ. But I just want you to know, church, that I am as imperfect as anybody in the room, and we don't use that as a license just to continue to sin. We say, God is the one who is perfect. But what his invitation is for us, he is our auditor. And I know that that's no fun. Nobody likes being audited. The Pharisees didn't like it either. And yet the invitation for us is to say, Jesus, check my heart, check my soul, check my life. Is there anything in me, whether it's as big as alcoholism or drug addiction, or if it's as small as, I'm not usually someone who struggles with anger, but I got angry yesterday about this stupid thing. What God's goal for you is that you become thoroughly converted. Thoroughly converted. I was having dinner with a guy last week, 2 years sober after a very, very rough life. And he gave his life to Jesus about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. And he's one of those like gung-ho for Jesus people, where it's like, all right, settle down. Let's talk through this a little bit. Very, very excited about it. So we had dinner, and we were talking through his faith journey. And he's walked away from a hard lifestyle. And it's only been about 1.5 years, 2 years. And yet the sins that he was confessing to me at dinner the other night, it's like, yeah, I've just been so self-righteous. I've been judging my roommate. And I'm like, dude, this is what I call thoroughly converted. Because he's not only after and trying to take care of like the biggest things that were so public, he is inviting Jesus into his very heart, mind, and soul and he's saying, Jesus, dig deep. If there's anything in my life that is offensive to the way of God, I want you to dig deep, I want you to find it, and I want to turn from it. Church, that is freedom. When you can get to the point in your life where it's like, Jesus, dig deep in my life. And the point isn't just so that we could be the most morally upstanding people that this community has ever seen. We don't drink, we don't chew, and we don't date the girls that do, right? Well, the point isn't that we're just upright, moral people. It's that when we confess and we turn from our sin and we're following in the way of Jesus, that's where freedom actually is. You're gonna walk through life light on your feet, no matter what happens, because you've been forgiven, you've been born again, and you've been set free. And the good news is this doesn't just happen at conversion. This can be your life every day. Being thoroughly converted, letting Jesus dig deep, and finding some freedom from some of these sins that maybe you didn't even realize were in your heart, but they're there. The bottom line is this, church, we got to give one another grace. We got to give one another mercy. We don't want to be the Pharisees who did everything right, but they neglected justice and faithfulness and mercy. We become these people because this is what we have received in Jesus. Let me pray for you. Jesus, we thank you so much for doing the transforming work in our lives that only you can do, Lord. Everything that we boast in when it comes to our own personal transformation, we boast in it because it's what you have done, not because we have done it, not because we've done the work and because we're good enough and we're strong enough. Jesus, everything is about what you have done in us. I pray, Lord, that as people of New Hope, as people that carry the label of Christian, we represent you well, not only to our community at large, but to our families, to our kids, to our parents, to everybody that we come across. And the reason is, Lord, because we want people to know you, to love you, and be transformed by you. God, we are imperfect. We can be hypocrites so easily. But Lord, we ask for grace. And we ask that your Holy Spirit would empower us to walk in the way of your word, to walk in obedience, and to be people of love and justice and faithfulness. It's in your name I pray. Amen.